1381. A 14-year-old boy walks alone into a horde of his enemies. 100,000 men surround the young King of England at Mile End, London. Abandoned and unprotected, the king's advisors had been executed by the mob or fled its wrath. They demanded the abolition of serfdom and further convictions, and the king accepted. Richard II, son and heir to Edward the Black Prince, and grandson to Edward III of England, by many accounts was heir to a great line of warrior kings, both his father and grandfather making names for themselves on the battlefields of the 100 Years' War, though this great legacy would be thrust upon Richard's shoulders far before he would be ready. In 1376, his father, heir to England, died, shortly followed by his grandfather the next year. At only 10 years old, Richard was crowned King of England, assuming the weight of his family's name as the last of the Plantagenets. In Richard's youth, the governance of England would fall to his council, dominated by his uncles John of Gaunt and Thomas of Woodstock. In the king's name, the council levied exceptionally high taxes on the populace of England to fund the war in France and Scotland, though these conflicts remained sour, with England slowly losing much of its control over old Plantagenet territories. For years, tensions would rise and rise until the institution of an unpopular poll tax would spark rebellion in Kent, soon to become nicknamed the Peasants Revolt. The rebellion grew quickly, spreading like fire across the southeast, until finally the mob marched on London, entering the city and being joined by many like-minded Londoners. They claimed that Richard had been deceived by evil councillors, attacking government buildings and executing any officials they found, including the Chancellor and Treasurer. With the English army far to the north, the king's uncles were nowhere to be found. Richard was forced to confront the rebels personally, meeting their leaders at Mile End, despite being alone, entering the camp voluntarily. Though he would quickly concede to all their demands, promising to grant the peasants greater rights and freedoms, pardons for all those involved, lower taxes, and most importantly, to punish the evil council that had caused all this in the first place. With their demands fulfilled, the Peasants' Revolt quickly dispersed, though Richard was now left fearful and paranoid of those who abandoned him. He was quick to renounce all promises he had made. Quickly, thousands of royal soldiers were mobilized, and as the rebels dispersed, they were rounded up and executed, with the king himself personally witnessing the deaths of many that had confronted him at Mile End. This drastic action and betrayal spread fear throughout most commoners and nobles alike, as Richard took his first steps towards absolute power. As Richard began to emerge from his minority and take full control of governance away from his council, his style of leadership slowly became apparent. The king had appointed many of his personal favourites at court to key government positions, showering them with expensive gifts and generosity. This alienated many others at court, including his uncles, who were still in France fighting the war. Coupled to this, Richard showed little signs of commitment to the war in France, refusing to personally lead any military campaigns and spending money frivolously on non-military expenses. Richard's inaction would lead to a bitter confrontation with his uncle John of Gaunt, who, despite being the most senior noble in the realm, was excluded from court. The alienation and conflict caused John to leave England to pursue a personal claim to the Castilian throne in 1386, leaving his son Henry Bolingbroke in his stead in England. With the absence of his most prominent nobles, Richard would face the wrath of an unhappy parliament, in 1386 being confronted by the so-called Wonderful Parliament, who demanded the removal of office of many of the king's close advisors, who had come to be despised by the people for their docility and corruption. Richard attempted to ignore Parliament's demands, though at the threat of no taxation he was forced to witness the impeachment of his favourite and endure a grueling investigation into his personal finances. The growing opposition from both Parliament and his own aristocracy caused Richard to tour the country in search of support, placing those close to him in powerful military positions, and testing the loyalties of others. He slowly began to gather military forces to support him in future actions. The king's opponents clearly saw the threat from this gathering of strength, and formed an alliance known as the Lords Appellant, headed by Henry Bolingbroke. They quickly confronted the king's gathering forces in Oxfordshire, in dispersing them and forcing many to flee to the country, then leading the king to another sitting of Parliament that came to be known as the Merciless Parliament, where Richard's close supporters were sentenced to death, those in captivity being executed immediately, and those still at large fleeing England for good. though the gains of the merciless Parliament would be short-lived, as in 1389 John of Gaunt returned to England and reined in the Lords Appellant. Following this, in 1394, Richard's wife, Anne of Bohemia, died, with Richard still heirless. Richard would remarry Isabella of France, the daughter of the French king, leading many to become suspicious of his French leanings. This would slowly lead Gaunt and his son to distance themselves from the king, fearing reprisal from their previous acts. The king would attempt his revenge in 1397 by ordering the arrests of many of the Lords Appellant, though surprisingly, Bolingbroke and Gaunt were excluded from this order. Richard flooded Parliament with his royal guards, forcing its members to convict the remaining opponents, causing those who remained to fear his tyranny further. Bolingbroke would once again confront the king in 1398, where Henry had become involved in a conflict with his past allies in the Lords Appellant. Richard exiled both parties, Bolingbroke for 10 years and his opponents for life, though Richard assured Henry that this punishment would not be extended and that Henry would retain all rights to his inheritance if his father was to die during his exile. However, once again Richard would betray his promises. When John of Gaunt died in 1399, the king immediately declared Bolingbroke disinherited and seized all of his inheritance. With almost all those who opposed him dead, in chains, or in perpetual exile, Richard now felt free to exercise his rights as monarch. Seemingly unconcerned with any threats at home, and with no more prominent lords to assist him, he departed from England in 1399 to combat a rebellion in English-occupied Ireland. Though little known to Richard, Henry Bolingbroke had not given up his claims, landing with little warning in the Humber estuary in July, at the head of an army determined to regain what was rightfully his.